This is On the Market, a Bigger Pockets podcast presented by Fundrise. Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to On the Market. I am super excited that you are all joining me here today for my conversation with Cal Inman, who is the creator and principal of ClimateCheck. ClimateCheck is a website that provides really cool and pretty unique data about what risks exist based on your property for climate. So whether that's wildfires or floods or extreme winds or hurricane, basically every property in the country has some level of risk from natural disaster or climate. And depending on where you live, it could be really different. Obviously, I talk about this a little bit in the episode. In Colorado, we have a lot of risk of wildfire. I experienced that directly with one of my properties. But if you live on the coast, maybe it's hurricane or wind or flooding or something like that. And this data that Cal and his team have created can be a really helpful asset to investors when they're underwriting their deals, whether you're predicting or trying to figure out where you want to invest next, or if you're looking at a particular property and want to understand the risk. That is really helpful when you're trying to understand what you should be buying. And that's what we're going to talk all about today, as well as some strategies that you can use to mitigate any of those risks. So with no further ado, let's get into my conversation with Cal Inman, the creator and principal at ClimateCheck. Cal Inman, welcome to On the Market. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I'm looking at I've previously looked into your background, and you are a real estate developer, a real estate investor, a grad school lecturer at UC Berkeley, and the creator and principal at ClimateCheck. So can you just tell us a little bit about your background briefly and how you got into all these things, being a real estate developer and ultimately the founder of ClimateCheck?
Yeah, I guess it sounds like a lot when you put it like that. I have a short attention span, I think, is the executive summary. I grew up in the Bay Area. My father was a journalist, and he covered real estate news. So I kind of got a deep dive into interviewing all these real estate developers, and I was just totally intrigued by it. Worked for a developer, kind of cut my teeth, learned a lot about the process, went out on my own, started doing small single family, then rolled that into apartments, then did more commercial style buildings, small office, small retail. Did that from 2009 to 2016 or so. Then started lecturing at UC Berkeley, Masters in Real Estate Development. And that was cool. And I still do that. It's a great experience. The folks in there are just super excited to go build buildings, invest. And while I was there, I kind of came across this climate data. And I had rental properties, and yeah, super curious how they're going to be affected by climate change. You read about climate change in the news. Icebergs melting. This is an existential risk that's going to affect everyone. And how are my properties going to be affected? Are my properties in West Oakland along the San Francisco Bay going to flood with sea level rise? Is there going to be another fire in the Oakland Hills that I experienced when I was a kid? Are those rental properties at risk for burning? And tried to search for the information, and it wasn't really available. And I primarily think about it when I was renewing insurance policies. Mm-hmm. But then I came across these climate risk data sets. And the next thing I found out was that a lot of big institutional developers and investors, big LPs, were using this data to inform their real estate decisions, right? Their due diligence, how they're going to improve properties, what properties they're going to dispose of, how they're structuring their insurance policies. And it felt like I deserved access to this information too. Smaller single-family homeowners deserved access to this information. And that's sort of set me on a new trajectory toward climate data and building ClimateCheck.
That's a really interesting story. I do want to get all into ClimateCheck, but now I'm curious just about your own real estate investing. First, are you still developing properties and buying rental properties? And are you primarily still doing that in the Bay Area of California?
Here in the Bay Area, yield on investments is tough. There's too much capital in the market, and I haven't been able to really make deals pencil for the last 4 years, and I was kind of early to exit. I still invest in real estate. I still own property, but I'm not an active sponsor in ground up real estate development deals at all. I'm 120% into this data world. I still lecture at UC Berkeley, so I still kind of keep my foot in it. A lot of friends are still active, and I invest in deals still. So I'd say I'm still active, but I'm not out there, boots on the ground, buying parcels, building buildings.
Got it. All right. Well, let's get into the data. Obviously, that is my area of interest and expertise. So can you tell me a little bit about, you said you were lecturing, you were curious, like what was your first encounter with this information, and what data is it? Like, what are you actually physically looking at when you talk about climate related data?
Yeah, totally. It's a really good question. So when we talk about physical climate risk data, we're looking at how natural hazards are going to increase or decrease in intensity moving into the future. And so that we look at 6 hazards: wildfire, flood, which is more complex, we can come back to that, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, drought, and high winds. And so we look at what's the risk profile of each of these perils today, and then what's the risk profile in the future, and how's that changing? So when we look at something like flood, for instance, we measure what's the probability it's going to happen, and then what's the intensity of it. So in the future, we have a 40% chance of a 2-foot flood on your parcel at 123 Main Street. And so we try to take these kind of very complex concepts and make them easy to understand, because I think most people get, basic percent chance of a flood happening that's a foot deep. So we give a 1 through 100 score of risk rating, 100 being the riskiest, 1 being the safest, and then we give these metrics alongside it.
And how do most real estate investors, or homeowners for that matter, I assume both groups use your tool, how do they use this data? Yeah,
so I'd say the primary group using this information are investors, the folks on the equity part of the capital stack, private equity, REITs, and they're using it the same way they look at any risk data. Due diligence of new assets, right? When we buy a new industrial asset that's a cross-docking station or a multifamily property, whatever you're buying, we do a lot of due diligence. I mean, protecting our downside in real estate is kind of like 90% of the work. And then creating the value is the last 10%. So when we look at all these factors, are there underground storage tanks? What's the market risk? What's the risk of the tenants? What's the risk of the municipality? Climate risk, the risk of these natural hazards increasing into the future, fits nicely into that due diligence process. So I'd say that's the first way it's used. Second way is kind of just overall portfolio analytics. Let's look at existing portfolios every year, and let's understand what the risk profile of it is. And kind of the last way it's used is to kind of inform investment thesis. So we have a portfolio of properties. We might have an outsized exposure to risk to a certain hazard, and we might want to diversify into other regions with different risks or less of that risk.
Got it. That makes sense. So it sounds like people, when you're buying a new asset, are using this to understand their own risk. And then when you're building a portfolio or perhaps even looking for insurance policies, this could be another time to start using this data. So you mentioned that institutional investors were previously using this data. Have they always been looking at climate risk and now it's becoming more important? Or is this a totally new data set to the real estate investing industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's a relatively new data set. We're bringing in more and more data. I mean, even when you look at phase one environmental data, this is relatively new, the 80s and the 90s. And then by the late 90s, it just became completely ubiquitous. Every commercial property we buy, we get a phase one report on. And we're kind of seeing the same progression here for climate risk reports. It's becoming best practices. I think you'll find most REITs, big private equity shops are using this data when they're buying new assets. And as more and more folks use it, the rest of the investors want to also be looking at it, because possibly when you're buying a property that you want to sell in 3 to 7 years, if the buyer of that property is looking at this data, you want to be aware of it before you purchase that property, because it's going to affect your exit value and ultimately affect your IRR, which is kind of what we're looking at when we're investors. What's the return? And that disposition value is probably the biggest chunk in your IRR calculation as an investor. So I think, to boil it down, I think that's probably the most important reason and why most people are starting to ingest this data.
That's really interesting. I didn't think about that, because obviously as an investor, if you're at risk for flood or wildfire, you want to know that during your hold period. But especially if you're buying, a multifamily or something that's going to be purchased by an institutional buyer, like a hedge fund or a private equity firm coming in there, if they're, as you're saying, looking at this, then you should be basing your valuations off the same thing that they're going to be basing their valuations off. So that's super interesting. What data are you creating this data? Do you have your own climate models, or are you aggregating other data from sources?
Yeah. What are the inputs? So, I mean, our team is 100% product focused. So it's a team of data scientists, climatologists, and what they do, and they're a lot smarter than me, what they do is aggregate all kind of the best climate data, downscaled climate data, academic data, government data, bring it all into one place, synthesize it in some ways so we can search it on a parcel level, and then query it for the information that's useful for you when you're buying a new property. We do some in-house modeling where there's gaps in that data, but I think if you think about it like a cake, all of the ingredients we get are academic and government sources.
Okay, so you're taking all of these third-party sources and, like you said, connecting them so that if I say I have 123 Main Street, you could have all this different data related to that property, and that as an investor or homeowner, you can get a good sense of what the risk is. Oh yeah,
I tend to oversimplify it. So like if you look at flooding, for instance, at your property at 123 Main Street, we use government elevation maps, which are topographic maps. We use government information and data around what soil type is at that property. And then we'll use these projected climate models to understand the future rainfall volumes. And then we'll do a flood model of the entire United States, and we'll understand at your property at 123 Main Street, what does water accumulate there and what's the depth of it. So there's a lot of synthesis and modeling into it, but again, all those fundamental building blocks are all government and academic data sources.
Got it. I actually came across your company because I, about a year or so ago, was investing or looking to invest in a multifamily syndication in Houston. And I talked to a friend who used to live in Houston, and he was like, man, you got to make sure you're not in a floodplain in Houston. And I was like, oh man, I've never even thought about something like that. And so I started Googling all this information and came across ClimateCheck, but all sorts of data sets that was complicated. It was hard to understand. So I definitely appreciate that you and your company are making it easier for people to simply understand what's going on there. Now, of course, some climate risk has always existed, right? Floods have always existed. There have been wildfires. What does the data tell you about how the quantity and severity of climate risk is changing over time?
Yeah. I mean, I think across every hazard's different, first of all, and every region's different. And even every neighborhood's different. We have different exposure to risk. And I think that's why it's really important to understand the data on a granular local level, because the story is different everywhere. But I'd say overarching kind of themes, we're seeing an increased frequency and severity of kind of the fundamental pieces of climate change, which are precipitation and heat. We're seeing more hot days and hotter days moving into the future. And I'm talking over a pretty big window of time, right? 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we're also seeing a higher frequency of heavy rainfall events. And those two things kind of feed into the rest of these hazards. So we're seeing an increased frequency of flooding and deeper floods, more inundation, and same with fire. Some regions are getting better, and they're all changing, and the hazards that each community is exposed to are different. But there is a higher frequency of these events.
And have you seen yet that the availability of this data and the increased risk of climate hazards, has it yet impacted homebuyer decisions?
I think on the home buyer level, there's a lot going into that transaction, and a lot of it's emotional. But I think it starts with, where's my job? Okay, I'm a remote worker. Where's my family? What's the school district? Probably the first question, what's the price point? And there's all these factors that go in. And same with the commercial real estate transaction. We're looking at a lot of things, yield, demographics. So this is, one data point alongside all these other things that we think about in a transaction, whether you're a home buyer or whether you're an investor. But to answer your question, there aren't strong signals right now impacting value and climate risk. That being said, as more and more people ingest it, and particularly once lenders start ingesting the data, we see a world where that does start affecting values, and something we need to think about.
Interesting. So a lender might, the appraisal, for example, might be impacted on a lender, or similar to how a lot of mortgage companies won't lend on a property that's not up to code or needs a ton of rehab work. If there is a property that has a significant amount of climate risk, it might be difficult to get a loan. I had not thought about that at all, but that's a really interesting point. I had more, when I was thinking about this show, my immediate thought went to insurance, right? Because you already start to see that insurance in places where there's risk of hurricane or flooding or wildfires or whatever, those have gone up a lot recently and are probably continuing to do so. Do insurance companies use this data currently, your data or any data like this, when they're evaluating properties?
Yeah, we don't license into the insurance industry, but they do. They look at all sorts of data. I think fundamentally they're underwriting your policy with something called a catastrophic risk model, which looks at historical data. But if you think about kind of what an insurer is giving you, they're giving you a policy that covers you for 1 year into the future. And when we're looking at these signals and climate risk, the profile of each of these hazards is changing slowly over time. So if they're only going to insure you for 1 year, that 10, 20-year look isn't so important for insurers. And they can adjust their risk as an insurer by changing the premium. Exactly what we've seen, right? We have a property here in Northern California, and the insurance has tripled in the last 2 years because of wildfire risk. And so I think it's just the alignment of the insurer versus the owner and the lender. It's different, and I think the owner and lender need to take a longer look.
That's interesting. So the risk that you're modeling out is over 10 or 20 years. And obviously it seems like with all things climate, the change is modest on a year-to-year basis, but it's the long-term trend that is concerning. And because the insurer basically gets to reset their own risk, right? They get to re-underwrite it once a year. They're not too concerned about it as long as the consumers are still willing to pay that increased premium.
Yeah, exactly. And I think insurers care. I'm not writing them off, but I think it's customers' perception, customer education on their end, and helping people understand why these premiums are increasing.
Yeah.
But I think building it into their model and how they price the premium, I think it's less important.
It's interesting because I had this experience, I guess it was in 2020. I have a short-term rental in the Colorado mountains, and similar to California, a lot of increase in wildfire activity. And my sister was actually staying at the property for the first time ever and called me and had to evacuate because there was a wildfire in the area. Fortunately, didn't lose the house, but it sort of really got me very nervous and got me to, beef up my insurance policy. But for a while, I couldn't even find an insurance policy that met my criteria. Like, I wanted to make sure I had business interruption insurance. I wanted to make sure that the replacement value was keeping up with the cost of construction and all these things. And it made me worried that in the future, some of these properties that are either like mine in wildfire risk or coastal or in a floodplain, like, is there a risk in your opinion that they will be uninsurable at any point?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that happen in California here. Folks can't find insurance, and the state is having to step in and create policy to help people get insurance. And so, yeah, there are these risks, and I think ultimately you can get insurance. It's like, what's the premium you have to pay for that risk? And how does that affect us as investors? I mean, insurance is a line item on our costs. It increases our OPEX. And if that expands too much, alongside all the other factors, maintenance and repair, which is also affected by these hazards, ultimately affects our net operating income and the yield of these investments. So I think it's an important factor to look at. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And I guess for me, traditionally having underwritten deals and analyzing deals, insurance is not something I normally think about that much, to be honest. Like, it is what it is. You assign some standard inflation pegged increase in costs, premiums go up 5%, 10%, but especially in these riskier areas, like, I understand that owning a property in the mountains in Colorado is risky and will become riskier over time. I should probably rethink how I'm modeling those premiums and make sure that the numbers still make sense on those kinds of deals.
Yeah, and I think also, with the data, I mean, for your property in Colorado, you can start understanding the risk, right? You're aware of it. It's a tangible risk. You've experienced it in evacuation. Next step is quantify the risk, understand, put rails around it, understand what the risk really is. And insurance is an impact, a line item impact, but there's, CapEx projects you can do on that property to reduce the risk. And that's really kind of how folks use the data. We give the risk data, and then the next step is, how do we protect ourselves, right? You can clear brush around the building. You could put smaller vents over your roof vents, finer roof vents, so embers don't fly in. There's very simple, inexpensive things you can do to that home, to that rental property, to reduce your risk of loss, some type of insurable event happening to that specific property.
Huh. That's super interesting.
Yeah. It's not, more than just quantifying how your insurance is going to increase over time, but what can we do to protect ourselves, protect our homes, protect our communities?
Right. Yeah, and this place in Colorado, I have, they do, there's an HOA. It's a small HOA, but they do, the HOA basically exists for fire safety, and they clear brush, and they offer these wood chipping programs where if you clear brush, they'll come around and do wood chipping. They put in 3 cisterns and retention ponds in the community in case there is fire. So I definitely resonate with what you're saying. Somehow I get all of that for $20 a month. That's all the HOA costs. I don't really know how that happens, but it seems like a great service to me. So I'm lucky in that I have some of those resources, but in your effort and your company's effort to sort of bring this data and information to mom and pop investors and not just having these institutional investors use this, is there a place where our audience and listeners can go to learn some of those common sense ways that they can mitigate risk and protect themselves against climate risks in their area?
Yeah, totally. I mean, go to our website, pull a report on your property. We give a 35-page deep dive into climate risk. And with each hazard that we cover, we give ways you can mitigate those risks, ways you can adapt your property to prevent damage. And they're pretty easy things. We list them from the kind of the least expensive to the most expensive. And so, we want to be a resource for folks to protect their properties. The goal is not to scare you and get you to sell your property in Colorado, but more, how can we help you? And how can we help you reduce your risk?
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not, it's obviously people are going to live in these places. It's about adapting and making sure that you're, just like with anything in your business, you understand risk and are taking the proper steps to mitigate it. And in terms of, I want to ask you, because you have experience as a developer, do you see this increased climate risk and some of this data that's coming out influencing developers? And I guess specifically, I'm curious the type of buildings that they're creating. Are they more climate resistant in some way? And the places where they're building, are they building more in areas where there is less risk, or is that something that is just maybe going to come in the future?
No, it's a really good question, and it depends on the hazard. And it depends on the developer and the type of development. The safest places in general that we see across the data, particularly for wildfire, are urban environments, urban infill, right? We built these natural protections. We have fire departments. We've got some space from the wildlife where the trees are, where the burns happen. But we do see, and we did a study with Redfin where a lot of new developments happen in the wildlife urban interface, right? Greenfield kind of suburban developments alongside the edge of the forest where fires happen. And so we are building kind of the newer suburban areas into these higher risk locations for wildfire. So those development patterns, are a little concerning. I think it's something just folks need to be aware of when they're thinking about a location for a development and what the investment thesis is around where to build.
Yeah, that's always been a question of mine, because you start to hear about, honestly, a premium for some of these features. As a consumer, a lot of people want climate neutral or climate safe buildings, whether, like you said, like, do they have the vents? Do they have defensible space? Any of the other, I'm not super versed on what the other mitigation strategies are, but like, it seems like not only is there a societal benefit opportunity, but there is an economic opportunity for developers to be considering these things as they are building new properties.
Yeah, completely. And understand the risks, address them. And I think that takes friction out of the transaction, whether you're renting the property or selling it to a homeowner or selling it to another investor. This information is becoming more and more ubiquitous, right? So the buyer knows, the renter knows about it, but say, hey, look, we understand these risks are here and we've done these 3 things to help mitigate the risks. And then it helps you move on from that point.
It makes me wonder, I'm not sure if you had data about this, but I'll put you on the spot. It makes me wonder if consumers will be asking for this in a rental situation too, right? I can imagine being a home buyer, it's your first home, you're in Colorado or California, and you've experienced these things and you're worried about wildfires or floods or whatever. I wonder if renters are going to start coming into, approaching their rental decisions with the same type of concerns and demands from their rental properties. Do you know anything about that at all?
I mean, you can imagine, right? I mean, it depends on the market. If it's supply constrained, you're going to, rent what you can get. And I think it's the same thing from investment, right? Supply constrained, you're going to kind of chase yield and buy the property you can get. But I think there's a world where everyone starts looking at this and want to understand it. Because look, if there's a flood event, a renter's impacted, right? There's loss to them. There's displacement. We do find that people search for hazards that they are familiar with, right? You've had an experience with wildfire. Folks in New Orleans, Houston, kind of hurricane areas have experiences with flood, whether it's storm surge or surface flooding, and it's been part of their life and something they think about. It's kind of an intuitive risk for them, for their location. So we'll see people searching kind of risks that they understand, even if they're moving to a new market. And so really what we're trying to do is kind of make everyone aware of all the risks, especially as we're moving to different states, different cities. I think there's a lot of good information in there that might not be as intuitive for people, but it's intuitive for the people that live there and have experienced those risks.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, I now am always thinking about wildfires because I had this hopefully one-off experience. But I mean, I lived in Colorado for 10 years. I'm sure in California, you hear about it every summer. You go camping and you can't have a fire, or you can see the smoke, and these experiences they impact you for sure, and they definitely make you think about how you can protect yourself. Do you have any data or high level stats about like the general risk in the country? Like, are most homes at severe risk of some sort of climate emergency or issue, or is this just limited to some of the cities that we've talked about so far?
Yeah, I think everywhere is impacted. I mean, the answer to that is there's risk everywhere. And it's, what is the risk? We think about the Southwest and extreme heat risk, something we haven't talked about today much, but this is a big risk. There's going to be a huge increase in the number of extreme hot days, and how does that affect you as a renter, as a homeowner, as an investor? There's going to be increased utility costs for AC. There's quality of life issues. Then we think about coastal cities and sea level rise. This is a big one. Flooding is pretty consistent across the U.S. A lot of areas are exposed to different types of flooding. Drought, in the West, we're seeing a lot more drought. So again, it's really region specific, but everywhere carries some type of change in your exposure to these natural hazards. So it's not necessarily like one thing everyone's going to experience, but we all carry some risk to climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like it's like a whack-a-mole thing. Like you look for one area, it's like, I don't want to be near a flood. And it's like, okay, you don't need to be near a flood, but you're going to get some wildfire. And it's like, well, I don't want wildfire. Well, you're going to get some extreme risk. Just shows the breadth of the challenge and the situation we're all going to be dealing with over the next couple of decades. Are there any areas in the US or even in the world that are like more climate I think the word's like resilient. And I don't mean like in terms of infrastructure, like how prepared people are. I mean, like from a natural sense, like, are there certain areas that don't like have relatively less climate risk?
I think as you move north more, certain risks decrease, get away from the coasts. I think kind of the urban core is probably the safest answer. And I think those community municipal adaptation strategies, building a seawall, building a fire break around the city, those are really important. Like how are we adapting as communities? Because these risks exist, and it's not like everyone's going to leave the United States and go to Canada or something. But how are we dealing with it as a community? Are we putting bonds in place to create adaptation strategies to keep the local communities safe? So I think a lot of this is about just engagement, discussion around the risks, and figuring out what our strategies on an individual property level, and then what our strategy is kind of as a neighborhood and a community.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if you know this. I live in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and I think it's about 26% of the Netherlands naturally is below sea level. They have reclaimed a lot of land. They pump out water and they sort of dredge. They've been doing this for 800 years or something like that. And they're obviously all worried about sea level rise because we're already below sea level here. And so it's interesting to see what kind of mitigation strategies different communities are taking. They're building huge seawalls and expanding dikes and all of these things. And it is nice to see that there is some proactivity. And it does sound like in the US, we're starting to see some more proactivity about mitigation strategies, planning in worst case scenarios. Do you have any information that you can share with us about that? Like, how are communities, municipalities, states preparing for some of these climate change centric risks?
Yeah, I think adaptation's a big conversation, and it's complex, and it is federal level, it is state level, and I think we're seeing most of the stuff happen kind of on a local municipal level. We see it here with how in California, where we have high fire risk, building fire breaks, putting together CAL FIRE, making sure it's well funded to protect from wildfires, educating individual homeowners about what they can do. And the same thing in Miami, right? We're thinking about, or where you live, sea level rise and what we're going to do about that to protect the cities. So I think it really all comes down to local solutions, and so engagement with those politicians and all those stakeholders.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think for our listeners here, if you're buying properties, in addition to looking at some of the risk that Cal's been talking about for your individual property, it would be helpful for you to also look at what your municipalities are doing and if they're acknowledging any risks or how they're preparing or resources that might be available to you to upgrade your property. A lot of times municipalities offer tax breaks or incentives to do some of these mitigation strategies. So that could be a really good option for people out there. When I was researching before this show, I read some article, I don't even remember where it was from, that said that Duluth, Minnesota is like the most perfect climate or like the most climate resilient place. Do you think like all of a sudden millions of Americans are going to converge on Duluth, Minnesota and start moving there?
Yeah. I mean, as a company, we try to stay away from, the extreme fear and trying to tell people sell your house now and move here, because I don't think that's necessarily a solution. But I will say there are a lot of smart people, folks in academia and kind of investors that are looking at these ideas of climate migration. And when these big events happen, where are folks going to move? And, what is safer? And exploring ideas of climate gentrification. And I do think there will be movement of people around when these kind of impactful events happen. And we've seen it in the past, big floods, folks get displaced and they go to other communities. And so I think it's something to watch and think about and kind of build into your investment thesis. And by no means are we trying to say sell now, don't go to this area. But I think it's a factor to consider as you're going out there.
Yeah, for sure. I thought it was funny, just like Duluth just seemed like such a random place. No offense to anyone from Duluth. But yeah, I was curious and actually written down a question for you is, do you think there will be climate migration? Because I read, I think both for Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and then the Houston flood, I'm blanking on what year that really bad flood was. People got displaced, left, and never really went back. And it did strike me that could, if there is increased risk of wildfire or flood in major metropolitan areas, that could, I don't know if it's going to be like a wholesale large migration change, but could have at least some migration and population changes in the U.S. because of some of these risks.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those two events are great examples of folks. And, where did they move? They moved to similar cities that had similar job market, supply of housing, similar supply of housing, but it's adjacent and close to family. So I think there's a lot of factors to consider beyond kind of the risk of the event happening when you're thinking about climate migration. And it's a complex thing to model out. It's so multifactorial, but it does happen as these events occur. And again, I think it's an important data point to think about and look at as you're investing or buying.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this information. We do have to get out of here in just a minute, Cal, but is there anything else you think our audience should know about climate risk for real estate investors or anything else just about the data that you think is worth knowing?
No, I think, use the information alongside all the other information you look at when you're doing your due diligence. Information's now available, accessible. All you have to do is go to our website and type in an address. Go to climatecheck.com, search an address, and try to understand your risk to climate change a little bit while you're looking at all these other data points in your investments.
Awesome. Well, thank you to Cal Inman, who is a real estate developer, investor, and the creator and principal at ClimateCheck. Thank you so much for joining us on The Market.
Hey, thank you.
Super interesting interview there with Cal Inman. Really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with him. I personally learned a lot and hope that you all did too. This has been something that I've been thinking about. As I said during the interview, I've had some experiences recently where a property I had came close to burning down in a wildfire. I've invested in some cities that have experienced significant hurricanes, for example. And I've just been curious to learn more as an investor what sort of risks are out there due to climate change and some of the changes in insurance and lending that Cal was talking about. And I thought Cal did a great job just sort of presenting the data as it is and talking about how to appropriately use it. He's not saying that you should be going out there and changing all of your plans or to be panicking. What he's saying is just to inform yourself about what risks exist and what you can do to mitigate those risks if there are significant ones that you're worried about for your particular properties. This is just like when we talk about evaluating an individual market or individual deal. There are tons of data points that you have to think about and factor in and decide which markets are right for you to invest in, which deals are right for you to invest in. And hopefully from this episode, you can now add climate data and climate risk to your factors and your underwriting when you're considering deals. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you have feedback or thoughts on this episode, you can hit me up on Instagram where I am at The Data Deli. And if not, we will see you on Monday for another episode of On the Market. On the Market is created by me, Dave Meyer, and Kaylin Bennett. Produced by Kaylin Bennett. Editing by Joel Esparza and Onyx Media. Copywriting by Nate Weintraub. And a very special thanks to the entire BiggerPockets team. The content on the show On the Market are opinions only. All listeners should independently verify data points, opinions, and investment strategies.